And there we go. And I'm so glad to see you all here this evening. Welcome to Show Us That You See Us. We have a panel here with scholars who we spoke with at our 2024 conference in Cleveland to sort of have a follow-up conversation to talk about bridging the gap between K-12 educators and academia. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will jump right in. So I'm going to start with our special guest, Lois McMillan, who is our teacher who is joining us for the beginning. So Lois, please introduce yourself.
My name's Lois McMillan. I'm from Grants Pass, Oregon, in the great state of Oregon. I've been a master teacher for the Gilder Lehrman Institute since about 2008. I think I go back that far. And most of the men were the three men I've worked with the most are Elliot West, Gary Gallagher, and David Blight. But this year I was named, I can't remember what it's called, Mary Kay Tackow, Teacher of the Year for the OAH. And then I was just announced as the National Teacher of the Year for the Daughters of the American Revolution. So this little Irishman who always wished to be a Curtin Irishman is now with the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Wonderful. We are so glad that you're with us here tonight, Lois. So Christy, please, if you would, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Christy Bruger. I am a professor here at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. I'm not originally from Oklahoma. I'm from the great state of Michigan, where there's a lot of love in the chat, which is awesome to see. Before being a professor and faculty member here at OU, I was faculty member at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, and a classroom teacher in both Michigan and Maryland for about 13 years. So teaching US history, which is where I originally got started with NCHE, and as a teacher attending conferences and then TAH grants and all of those kinds of things. So this is definitely a place that is home in so many ways. And I also serve as past chair of NCHE board. So I'm really happy to be here tonight and spend some time with everybody in conversation.
Thank you, Christy. Mike?
Hey, everybody. My name is Mike Butler. I am the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Flagler College in St. Augustine, more of a smaller liberal arts college, but being in the great state of Florida right now puts us with the topics that I teach in the areas of my specialty, the civil rights movement, the Florida Black freedom struggle, Southern cultural history, right at the crossroads of some of the, shall we say, complications and challenges that we face in the K through 12 classrooms. My accent probably gives it away, but I'm from LA, Lower Alabama. I did my graduate work at the University of Mississippi and have a great group of people who helped train and prepare me to step up when I need to defend the right of all of us to teach these topics and hopefully to be an ally in some way, shape, or form. So I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Thank you. And Ed?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Ed Ayers. I'm a historian. I taught at University of Virginia for 27 years, ended up as dean, then with the University of Richmond, where I was president. And now this is what I care about, is actually improving history education, learning from teachers about what might be useful. I'm former president of the OAH and been lots of Gilder Lehrman seminars and teaching American history seminars and those kinds of things. But I know we still have a long way to go. So I was so delighted when Jessica organized this and invited me to be a part of it. So hello, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm going to launch a quick poll while I introduce myself, because I think I know a lot of folks in the room. Just interested to hear what your education role is, so we know who's in the space. So I'm Jessica Ellison. I'm the executive director of the National Council for History Education. I come from a museum education background. I worked at the Minnesota Historical Society for 18 years before joining the team here at NCHE. And I love teachers with my whole heart, and I believe that what they need is as many allies outside of the classroom as we can provide. And so that's my vision for NCHE, which is one of the reasons why we assembled this panel this evening. So we are going to have a conversation, but please do put your questions in the Q&A, which we will respond to at the end. But we're going to start off with Lois. Lois is a current classroom teacher, and we always like to elevate the voices of our teachers as much as we can. So
Uh,
Lois, if you could talk to us a little bit about what are your challenges? What are your major concerns that are happening in your history classroom at this time?
I've been really lucky to live in a community that really focused on education. It's only recently that we've seen this, the politics of, this is recorded, so I'll just say nuttiness going in and pervading my classroom. I just want to, I'm going to back up and tell a lot of people, I've seen a lot of people in that are participating that I've had in different classes or done stuff with. But a couple of years ago, Ed, I offered a Civil War class in my school about 4 years ago. And the administration said, yeah, okay, well, hopefully we can get 25 kids to sign up. And the first day was open, 176 kids signed up. So kids want to learn history. But of course, then we're right at that nexus of then I get a whole semester to teach. Really, my area is the maritime aspects of the Underground Railroad. I can fill at least 3 a day. Now, they couldn't give me all those classes, so kids been waiting to take it. And then as a regular classroom teacher, this may be a bigger challenge. I've been in the classroom for 33 years. I'm 64 years old. So I have figured out a little bit how to avoid challenges. And I see, Jessica, we talked about it a little bit on the previous panel, and I talked about with young teachers, there's a difference between courage and wisdom. So I can get around some issues and not be controversial. But I think the biggest issue that I need help from professors is understanding the content. We talked recently. The first day of school, they take away the 2 Civil War classes that I had, and they were packed. I think I had 35 kids in each class, and said, we lost our AP Gov teacher. You're going to teach AP Gov for the first time. And I look over the vastness of my career. I've taught welding. I've taught whatever needed to be taught at the time, because that's what we're handed. So I'm sure the chat's blowing up because there's a lot of teachers in here on the first day of school. You hear that you're going to do world history and you've never done it. Or you're going to teach econ, which I'm now teaching econ. It's a nightmare because I have zero interest in it. But I really don't have the historical content. So my question to you is, and I'm going to, the 3 of you, and Christy, I'm going to pull you in on this. One of the struggles that I've seen, I've had 17 student teachers, and even for myself, it's the historical content and staying current. I think that when I can look bells and whistles teacher, I can look great in front of an administrator who doesn't know any history. But I have to have true historical content and it be current for me to be really a good teacher and a history teacher And I can't, and the methods aren't as important right now for me as content, because if I have the methods, I think, but if the lesson doesn't have true historical content, it's like the emperor with no clothes. So I guess what I'm interested in, the NCHE has those 10 brilliant habits of the mind, history habits of the mind. So I'm kind of wondering, can you give us in your careers where your learning curve was in certain areas and what we should be looking for to change our teaching, our history, whatever your expertise is? Ed, your new book is really fantastic. I'm rewriting a lot of my stuff that I teach from 1800 to 1850. Especially, I had changed it for the Civil War class that was eliminated, but I did use a little bit of it in AP Gov. So I'm really curious. And I think one of the things I thought was really interesting about, you had a conversation about when you went to Vietnam, and you kind of experienced the same kind of learning curve that a lot of us have to do in order to be in the classroom. So for us, what we need help from you guys is historical content, going to seminars, going to different stuff and learning that stuff and reading books. Books, it's an interesting thing. We should be reading books, huh?
That's great. Thank you, Lois. Ed, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, theoretically, what a lot of the work that we do together, Lois, is about exchanging content. And, I've been in some of the same kinds of context, but it occurs to me that there's still too much of a trickle down model, that we have content and somehow it's going to trickle down through uncharted channels into classrooms in some way. And along the way, it's like a Rube Goldberg thing. There's all kinds of valves and towels wrapped around leaking pipes and all of this. And so I think people would assume that the division of labor should be we create new knowledge and somehow it makes its way into the classroom. But that seems to be broken. One of my favorite cartoons, believe it or not, for the Chronicle of Higher Education, is some professional-looking guy walks out of his house and there's a voice from above that says, "The world needs articles, your articles." And unfortunately, that's kind of what it's like. There's nobody telling us why we should write these things or why we should care or why anybody else should care. It's just like, I just kind of feel like this is what I should do. When in fact, of course, it would be a lot better if people would say, hey, I'm in this classroom teaching this new class. What I really wish that we had would be this explanation or this piece of information. So I think the fundamental model that we have, to the extent we even have one, doesn't work very well. And it's because people who are writing history are not writing it necessarily with the right purpose in mind. When we do write purpose, it's a textbook, but textbooks are built not to change anything. They've got to match the standards or the syllabi that people already have. So if you color outside the lines at all, nah, that's too weird. We don't want that. So the vehicle that does exist of a textbook turns out to be a poor way to introduce things. I won't keep talking, but I will say I have a suggestion for ways to break this, but I'll not just keep rattling on now. But because I actually think we're at a moment in history when we can just set that aside as a failed model, that we can't wait to have only to talk to teachers who have the luxury of spending a summer in a seminar. And we need to find ways to get directly to people who are teaching a new class, to new teachers, to teachers who have other responsibilities, which of course is all teachers. So I think that we have before us ways that we'll be able to stop trickling down and start collaborating and actually having the assignment kind of given from people who are in the classrooms teaching to scholars and say, maybe you could do this because we need that. So that's my own take, is that what we have ways to share content is really not very effective at all. Not to mention paywalls between teachers and scholarly journals, and the way that corporations have bought a lot of the historical record and put that behind paywalls as well. So the content is both proliferating, but it's also withheld from people who need it. So with a slight prodding, I can talk about some of that stuff later, but for now, I'll step aside.
Thanks, Ed. Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
Wow. I have quite a few thoughts. I think what Lois just put her finger on, though, is not a problem with content not reaching the teachers. I think it's a problem for academics being unavailable to share that content with teachers. I think that one of the things that I am most happy with, given the latest crises that have occurred in Florida, is that it has put me in a network with NCHE. It has put me in a network with the Gilder Lehrmans of the world. It has put me in a network with the Florida Conference of History Education, with the Florida Council for Social Studies. I've asked that question a lot, Lois, of teachers, and what can I do? Not what can you do? You're doing enough. And part of the repression is a model of exhausting the teachers by giving them so much to do that they just can't keep up with it all. What can I do to help? So I flip your question a little bit and ask, what can I do better? Establishing networks, making contacts with organizations like this, befriending Christy and Ed, offering my services, connecting with people in state departments of education. right? Understanding what those standards are. I mean, first and foremost, it's on me to know my topic, right? I need to know my topic. And I know that's easier said than done, but like, or that's simple to say, but like Ed said, in the academic model, it is, what have you been publishing? What is your project? Well, one of the things that I sort of had to reorientate myself in considering was last year, literally at this moment, when I'm thinking of an academic conference, to bring all these different constituencies together, whether it's teachers and organizations, state, national, local, right? This is professional development that matters. It's professional development that matters within my academic community, right? So being available is something that many teachers have told me that they wish more academics would do. Simply be available and be willing to offer their services to organizations like NCHE. Now, for me, that's I can make myself available, but I also have to know my stuff. And I also have to know how to communicate my stuff to teachers in a usable, digestible way. So that takes a little time to refine from a traditional ivory tower perspective, right? So I think to answer your question, when it comes to the content thing, I call on my colleagues to get involved and to reimagine what they consider to be professional development, valuable professional development, to network with organizations that provide avenues for the content to be shared. And then when it comes to me, when I'm given the privilege and the opportunity to speak about topics that I'm passionate about, being able to convey that to people in a usable manner for their students is my responsibility. So those are my initial thoughts on that, Jessica.
Which is, I mean, that's what teachers do, right? Like they take their content and they put it in a usable, digestible format. So Christy, as a professor of education, what would you say?
So, Lois, I love your question because I think inherent or foundational to your question is the genuine curiosity and love for the subject matter that we have the privilege of teaching, right? And wanting to know more and being curious about all of those things, big and small, that come into play as we think about and engage with our students. So just as you were asking that question and kind of setting it up, and as someone who is finishing up her 29th year, I'm really close with you there. And it gets us thinking, right, about like all the things that we've had the privilege of engaging with and learning. And then also, in some cases, the privilege of forgetting and having to relearn in different ways. And so one of the things that I was really hearing, or it was your question was making me think about, was what we do as classroom teachers and those of us that study education is we think about this notion of pedagogical content knowledge, right? So we have this idea that there's this content, there's this font of knowledge that we have in our colleagues here who have devoted their lives to that engagement and connection to interpreting the past, to helping us think about and understand where we've been. And then it becomes our responsibility as teachers and educators to think about the students with whom we have the privilege of engaging. And what do they know? What don't they know? What misconceptions do they come with? And so I would pose to us, how do we not only gain greater knowledge for our own curiosities, that in turn become these places for our classrooms, but also thinking about the distinct nature of our students and the ways in which we have to nuance that. And I think that goes beyond simply methods. It's a deep thinking about what my job is as a teacher. And I think, Ed, you had mentioned it's not that model of the flow through. Because Ed said it, then Lois can say it, and now we've got someone in the 12th grade that can say it. But it's this very nuanced interpretation of the audience for whom we get to work. And I think this gets us thinking about, or at least it gets me thinking about a lot of what I walked away with the conference from, and thinking about what we owe to each other. And Mike, I think you kind of connected with this. What do we invest in one another, and in turn is invested in us? And I think that we all are active recipients of these relationships in different ways. The power, the energy, the enthusiasm you have for your classroom and the work that you get to do with your students, Lois, pays off when they make their way into Mike's class. They make their way into, hopefully, if they make their way over to teacher ed, into my class, and then I get to send them back to be that 18th or 19th or 20th student teacher, right? So it's thinking about how we network, not only the work we do, but I think about that in terms of the content as well. So it's incredible if we live in a college town where we can knock on our favorite historian's door to come to our team meeting or to our departmental meeting, or we're members of NCHE that can engage in a webinar like this. But how do we also capitalize on the interest, enthusiasm, and really the deep-seated knowledge that your colleagues have? And I don't want to get too far afield, but I think a lot about what professional learning communities were in their inception and what they have become. And Lois, as you're kind of nodding your head, I'm wondering what happens. And I've had a couple of opportunities to do this when a history department in their PLC gets to say, we're going to read X text by a historian, as opposed to, we're going to review these data that have been provided about attendance. What does that do differently? And how does that engage, invigorate, center ourselves as intellectuals, and then allow us as those intellectuals, both of history and of education, then to engage with our students? So thinking about that, again, knowledge for what and how is, I think, the big question that I'm left with your great question.
Thank you. Lois, do you have any
I
thoughts?
think it's really, yeah, I do. Stacy in the chat brought up, I often say to my kids, hey, I don't know, right? And I will do that. I don't act like I'm an expert, but I think the other part, and I really am interested, especially from a historian standpoint, and Christy, this will be interesting to you. About 10 years ago, I want to say maybe 15 years ago, the Japanese put out their history textbooks. If you have heard this, then you'll have to hear it again. But put out their history textbooks, and they neglected to put in the rape of Nanking. So when China read it, they were a little bit irritated, right? And so Japan, according to these 4 professors, they were education professors, this is the story they told me. And they said, we need to rewrite. We need to face our history. This came up today in my classroom. So maybe it was more than 10. I can't remember. It doesn't matter, because what ends up happening is they contact Gilda Lehrman. Gilda Lehrman contacts me and says, why don't you fly in and meet Lois Macmillan and see how she teaches slavery? All right. So that came up today. And when we were talking today, what was interesting, Mike, about your conversations in Vietnam and about Vietnamese exceptionalism that you said that you face, we see American exceptionalism, which I thought was interesting because I never thought about it until you said that. But then I thought, yes, I do know that, because that's what the Japanese were doing. So today, when I was teaching the Long March, and it's such a fantastic story. You guys all know it. And if you haven't read Unbound by Dean King, it's an awesome book about the Long March and the 32 women that survived it out of the 100,000 men. Obviously, I'm leaning towards women just because they're tougher. And I did say some things like, to my champion wrestler in the room, don't think you're too tough, do you now? But but that kind of empathy for the Chinese, especially in the Long March, that historical empathy that's in our History Matters thing. History Matters, not History Matters, the 10 history things. You know what I'm talking about, Jessica, if you can help me.
Habits of mind.
Thank you. Anyway, historical empathy is where we landed. And we started talking about the Japanese. And then I just went to slavery because 2 of the kids in the class had my Civil War class. And I said, we teach slavery. We teach, how'd you feel? Did it make you feel bad? And I said to this one kid, and it just came out of my mouth, I said, Skylar, you're a white kid. Did it make you feel bad about slavery? And he said, I don't know how to answer that question. I said, yes, you do. And he said, no, it didn't. I thought it was really interesting. And he did this great job on reading the slave narratives. So we really talked about facing our own history. Those are conversations also that I have a little bigger background than some other people to have those conversations. Can I talk about empathy and how you guys feel like we should be teaching that in the classroom. This totally happened today accidentally. It really did. And we got off track. That's what also makes history interesting. By the way, I never complete a lesson, obviously.
I'm gonna I'm gonna take that question about empathy and kind of fold it up in another question that I was thinking about. Is we had this conversation at the Cleveland conference about kind of what teachers were facing and how scholars and academics are thinking about it. And so I wanted to ask Christy and Mike and Ed to kind of reflect a little bit on, yes, like what Lois is asking, how do we teach empathy? But what kind of reflections have you had, empathetic reflections since the conference, thinking about how you and your colleagues can support teachers in the classroom? We had a lot of good conversation.
I think Ed should go first.
I went first last time, so I was holding back. You know, I think there's something to say that both Mike and I are white Southerners who've chosen to study our own history for a living. I describe myself as a cheerful guy who gets up and thinks about the worst things in American history for a living. And because all my books in various ways are about crime, slavery, war, you know, disfranchisement, segregation, and all these kind of things. And why would I do that? It's partly because of a sense of obligation. Unlike your class, your student Lois, I do feel the burden of the history that I've chosen to stay in the South, where I think this work matters, and working with the Board of Education and on monuments and all that kind of stuff. But I sometimes, and empathy basically, well, I'll tell you this, one of my books was assigned to a college up in New England by a former graduate student of mine. And he said, some guy came up and said, this book reads like it's written by a woman. So it's all about empathy, you know? And I said, great, I'll take it. Not only do they're more successful on the march, but the empathy is actually, I think, of all the things that our discipline might be able to teach, that's one of the top three things. Is get outside of your own skin, get outside of your own time, get outside of your own gender, get outside of your own religion, and imagine someone else's life. And I think that of all the disciplines, and as you know, my degrees are actually in American studies, so I've written about literature, but we actually are empathetic with people who actually lived. You know, fiction has a powerful engine of empathy, but when we do our job right, and we're connecting with people who were actually trapped in a particular moment in history, and how did they survive it or transcend it, I think is really the most useful thing that our kids could learn in school. So I don't know if it's hip or not, but I think empathy is really the point of doing history.
Well, and Ed, I want to make a connection then too to what you just said, is you have to step out of your own experience, and we need academics and scholars to be able to do that, to connect with teachers as well. I mean, you know, I've been taking frantic notes here, and the idea of like making things usable. I think empathy and putting yourself in the shoes of a K-12 teacher in this moment who is juggling, I mean, whether you're in Virginia, where there's currently schools that are changing their names back to be named after Confederate generals, or Oklahoma, where the Oklahoma State Superintendent is making all kinds of interesting choices, and then or in Florida, which is, you know, kind of the poster child for educational dissonance. Academics bringing in empathy for K-12 colleagues is really powerful.
And I think it's important when we say empathy for K-12 colleagues, it's not pity.
That's right.
Respect,
That's absolutely right, Ed. It is respect. It is deference in lots of ways, because you're doing the hard work immediately in front of the public in ways that we are once or twice removed in ways. And so that empathy is multifaceted, right? It's the empathy that Lois is talking about of building between her students and the content she's teaching. It's about her students and her. It's the communities with us and vice versa. So it's really thinking about this idea of empathy as something that is not just what happens within a classroom, but it's as a result of really good history instruction and history experiences, I would say, because it's not just about instruction, right? It's something that you feel in all kinds of ways. And it's again, it's that empathy towards those individuals and circumstances in the past, but how we as individuals within communities understand them and navigate those through our own perspectives, and then how we navigate with one another when we leave the classroom. And I think that's just so vitally important and often lost, because those of us that are here in the webinar tonight are situated in that space. And so we might not think to say it out loud, but for those who aren't in the webinar, saying that out loud, you've come to history class today, 8th grade US history, become a more empathetic citizen than you were yesterday, is a powerful statement to share with someone who's 13. And it really changes the ways in which they then engage with and connect with the work that you're doing with them.
If I could, in academic form, put a footnote to my comment, I'd just like to say that what I mean is disciplined empathy. This isn't just feeling bad, right? You have to know what was the situation in which these people were. It goes back to Lois's comment about content. Just feeling bad without having any sense of context or understanding doesn't get you anywhere. But actually being able to comprehend the concreteness of a historical moment, of a historical challenge, I think is where good intentions and knowledge meet. And I think that students will be more empathetic if they have faith that the teacher, the historian, knows what they're talking about, and that this is true. This really was the moment. So empathy is not just squishy feelings. It's actually recreating the context in which people in the past confronted challenges in their lives.
Yeah, I have a ton of thoughts, and I hope that I can articulate some sort of helpful answer. Yeah, I saw in the chat someone said something similar to what I say. I'm not here to excuse. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. There's a difference, right? The other thing that I think we need to be really conscious, that I try to be conscious in separating, is the difference between history and nostalgia, right? We say that we love history, but we don't love history. History's dirty. History makes us feel a certain way. I don't make you feel a certain way. You know what makes you feel a certain way? The primary sources that I teach with. I don't have to tell you how to feel about these sources. I can share the sources with you and ask what your response is given the historical context that we're studying, right? That's what causes people to think about being in someone else's shoes that they could not relate with in any other way. So I think the primary sources are something that we can use effectively to help cultivate empathy without, as Ed said, demanding that you feel a certain way that's squishy and lovey and no, history doesn't care about the way it makes you feel. Now, the other thing that I think Ed touched on that's true for me, and this gets back to Jessica's question about the conversation that I had with teachers during the conference. After our panel, yeah, I don't know. I'm my hardest critic, right? I'm always like, gosh, I wish I'd have said that. Dang, I wish I would have responded that way, And you're always thinking, oh man, that was a popcorn fart. I wish I could go back and do that differently, right? To have teachers come up to me and thank me was humbling. Humbling. To say, you don't have to be here, but you are, and you're trying. And you are speaking the truth that we feel is often not heard. So the empathy in and being asked, why do you do this work for teachers? Yeah, I care about teachers a lot because, to quote Dr. King, we are all wrapped in a single garment of destiny. Your challenges and your students are going to be my challenges and my students in the not too distant future. So we are all in this together, educationally speaking, right? We forget that, I think, sometimes in higher ed. But when it comes to what I didn't know about the topics that I study, what I didn't know about lynching, what I didn't know about the civil rights movement, or even worse, what my fourth grade school book in Alabama said about the Ku Klux Klan in the 1890s. I was determined that my students would know more about these topics than I did when I was their age. And learning about those topics and having empathy for not just the people that we study, but the people that I teach. At a time like this, when, as I think Lois said, the political nuttiness, we'll call it, has seeped into the classrooms, what kind of hypocrite would I be learning about these sacrifices and people who lost literally their lives for wanting to register to vote, for trying to equalize teacher salaries, for wanting the privilege to sit at a counter and eat just like any? What would that say about me if I study these stories and I tell them and am motivated by them and talk about what a great example of what true Americanism looks like, and I remain silent at a time where I'm told not only can you not talk about these stories, but we are going to penalize you in some way, shape, or form if you do. Studying the sacrifices and the experience of others brings out, in my opinion, the best in us as American citizens. And I think that's something that I have brought from the topics that I study into the contemporary fights that we have against a movement, by the way, that is at odds with popular support for public education and reading. And I'll leave that there.
So I'd like
Could we
to,
talk about, can we talk about Rob's question in the Q&A?
of course.
Yeah, I absolutely. Can I say something? Are you talking about Robert Good's wonderful question about the university system, Christy?
I am, because this is one of the questions. So I'm going to read it because it's weird that we're talking about it. We're the only ones that can see it.
Yeah.
So Robert Good says, the university system currently doesn't provide academic historians with many incentives to engage in service. How might we create incentives for those historians to engage with K-12 teachers and organizations that serve them? This was one of the things, and it strikes me, and it's not really my question to answer, but it strikes me one as a fabulous question. It was one of the things that I was left thinking a lot about from our conference, because I think, Ed, you may have made the statement around that there isn't much incentive, and I pushed back a little bit to say, but in education there is incentive. That's part of the work that I do as a faculty member in a college of education, is liaisoning and working with K-12 teachers in context. And so I walked away thinking about, I have that privilege of liaisoning and being in both places. And so what am I doing to potentially help our historians link with our K-12 and creating those spaces, whether they're universities or they're in PK-12 classrooms. So anyway, thank you for asking that question. It's fantastic. And again, I'll turn it to my colleagues for whom the question is more appropriately asked.
Well, just by the way, I just thought about this, Robert. I love that question. Bankers have to put in so much community hours, and it is mandated. Did you know that? So when I'm on these committees in my local community, I'm like, how many bankers? Why are you at this meeting again? Well, we have to put in so many hours. So it would be interesting if your evaluations relied a little bit on not just publication, but serving K through 12 teachers.
The thing is, so I was Dean of Arts and Sciences, then I was a president, so my hands are red with complicity and all this. But ironic, and I've been working really for 30 years to try to get the profession to expand its definition of scholarship to include digital stuff, for example, and I actually chaired a committee for the AHA who wrote the statement about the recognition of digital scholarship in hiring, tenure, and promotion. And the sentence that we began that with, the AHA has now adopted into the broader statement: scholarship is an ongoing conversation about matters of enduring consequence. Okay. What that means is a contribution to that conversation can be writing another article that the voice from above tells you. But it could also be a blog or a Substack or a working with teachers in a systematic way. My experience has been that the choke point in a lot of this is our department. If the department would say, we value this, and when it comes up for tenure promotion, that the department votes unanimously to support someone who has poured a lot of themselves into this work, dean's committees will respect that. I oversaw 150 tenure cases at UVA, and you could see that other departments defer to the judgment of individual departments. We have a lot more, we being historians, have a lot more control over our destinies than we believe. And, you know, I know when I was in the department, I like blaming the idiots up above me in the dean's office or the presidency. But when I got into those places, I saw, you know, there's a lot more you could do if you just take a stand and define this as what the profession is, of what your scholarship is. So, and I'd also say there are so many, I don't want to act like, you know, this is a rare breed of person who gives themselves to this work. Every department in the country has people who devote themselves to this. And, you know, one reason I chose U.S. history is I thought that the channels would be a lot shorter since everybody in America takes American history, right? Well, if you're teaching, you know, something more remote in time or space, the opportunities aren't as available. But so there's a lot of people of goodwill, but I think the limits are limits we put on ourselves very often. Mike, I saw you nod, so I will use a teaching technique and encourage you to say something about that, since you might agree with me.
Ah, you're getting me back for calling on you to answer the last hard question first, I see. Well played, Ed. Well played. Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that we're often limited in the academic imagination for what constitutes service. As department chair, one of the things that I stress, and to Rob's point, he's absolutely right. You know, that there often is little inside incentive to get involved in things like this. But one of the things that I've learned, due in large part because of venues like this and opportunities like this, is to encourage my faculty to think about service beyond the college boundaries, right? That service is not just serving on the discipline committee. Yeah, that's important, right? But the service to the bureaucratic state is going to continue. We're always going to have that. What I need to do as, you know, not someone who is quite as high up as the idiots that Ed would blame, but I'm middle management, right? Sometimes, is to say that we have to be creative with what constitutes service. To me, service to the profession, service to educators, service to the community means a hell of a lot more than serving on a campus committee that we are contractually obligated to serve on anyway. So now, to Rob's point, one of the things that sweetens the pot is when NCHE says, we will give you a small stipend as a result of our appreciation for your day. You know, the people in my department are like, hey, man, I'll do it. I just need gas money to Orlando to help. So the other thing that Ed said that I think is right is that, you know, I'm not a suffering martyr. There are a lot of people who are good teachers who want to be involved in this stuff on my end of academia, and they simply don't know how, because we're all speaking different languages. We are all fighting the same battles, but we're speaking in different languages. So expanding what service means, connecting to organizations that'll give you, you know, gas money to drive 3 hours to speak to 20 teachers. That's stuff that many of the teachers in our department would absolutely love to do. And that's something that I take back to my department that I hope bears fruit, if not in the immediate future, then down the line.
I would only add that doesn't have to be gas money. The imprimatur of, I'm a partner with NCHE, which is a leader in this. So just a line on the Vita is a valuable commodity when you come up and see if you can move out of associate professor to full professor. So there's a kind of exchange that goes on that is more valuable than we might think.
Absolutely. That title, and Ed put it well, that title is currency. NCHE, having that on your resume means that you're involved with the National Council for for history education. And that matters. And I put that upon myself to explain to other faculty why that matters. So good point, Ed.
And then as I think about this, so also serving in that middle management spot of department chair, how do we communicate that with our colleagues that and so when I think about education, we think about the AERA, so associate, now I can't remember what AERA stands for. No, research and education. So Linda is in this, she'll put it in there. But anyway, we think about that. But so that's valuable to a certain audience that reads my dossiers, that reads dossiers within our department. And then there's also the audience that reads our dossiers that says NCHE. Well, that means this is in a community engaged. Thank you for our American Educational Research Association. That we think about how am I engaged scholar in the community? And I know more and more as we have Carnegie engaged faculty and institutions, that those pieces of what are faculty doing that not only engage in the profession as the profession of others that are sitting in similar buildings and teaching similar classes, but really thinking about the field or the profession as being those that are broadly connected to it becomes important. And I'll just say one other thing about this. Invitations also go a long way. One of the things that, Mike, I really liked how you said, because I would agree with you, that being in conversation with teachers is humbling, right? All that is done and can be done that impacts students that may or may not ever be ours is incredible. And so when we think about that, the idea that any of the three of us would simply knock on your door and say, Lois, can you make space for us today? Seems incredibly presumptuous, right? And the difference, right, there's this mutual feeling of like, no, never, you can come anytime. But I think that invitation to put one more task on a teacher's list, to simply say, to connect with that person that you aspire to have talk with your kids or talk with your department or be in conversation with, a simple email that is an invitation. We have a team meeting at 8 a.m. every Wednesday afternoon. Can you join us? That's an incredible gift. And though that's when it's easy to say yes. It's harder to say yes if we're not sure where to go or to whom. But when the invitation, that one line of "Can you join us" comes, it changes things.
Well, and we can be a conduit for that.
Yeah.
NCHE can be a conduit for that, to connect K-12 educators and academics in a collegial sense. Like, we're all educators, we're all learners. And so we are happy to do that. I wanted to address a question in the chat from Katie Parada, which I think is really of the moment. And she says, how would the panel support and advise teachers who teach in anti-divisive concept states like Florida and Georgia? I teach in an MAT program and I feel really strongly about teaching historical content and methods, but don't want them to lose their jobs. What are your thoughts?
Mike, do you want to start as
I'll
one
start.
divisive concept law state to another?
Yeah, this is one of the things that was a topic of conversation at the Teaching Difficult Topics conference that was hosted at Flagler, right? Look, I think one of the things that I learned was that we need, as academics and teachers, to know the state standards, period. It starts with the state standards. What are they? What are the enforcement mechanisms of these laws? HB 7 in Florida has no enforcement mechanism, which leads us to the point that there is a difference between a recommendation, a mandate, and a prohibition. There are a lot of recommendations that come out of the Florida legislature. There are fewer mandates. There are even fewer prohibitions. So the enforcement mechanism is often non-existent because it's meant to provide, to create a chilling effect, so that at the local level, these administrators have to make determinations based on just simple fear. So, number one, for me, it's the state standards. What do the state standards say? because there are very few legislative recommendations, including the African American history standards that got all this publicity in Florida, I learned were just pretty much ignored in many school districts. Yeah, we're not going to teach slavery was beneficial to both sides. Why? Because we don't have to. One of the things that I learned is ignoring a request is, in fact, an educational strategy. Ignoring a request is an educational strategy. That blew my mind. I'm like, what? We don't have to? No, because there's no enforcement mechanism, then force the people above you to say what the consequences are. And if it's something like scanning books, look, a lot of this is to make your jobs as teachers more time consuming and more uncomfortable than they already are. So that you're exhausted and you just say, forget it. I'm not having the autobiography of Frederick Douglass in my classroom library or whatever. One of the things that I learned, which was, I'm going to give a shout out to somebody who's here. I don't want to call her by name because, you know, Florida, but she basically said, I had over 1,000 books in my school library, in my classroom library, I'm sorry. And, you know, classroom libraries, you have to scan each and every title you have. And that's part of the wearing down, time-consuming process of forcing compliance, okay? So what did this teacher do? This teacher basically said, I have sets of books that number in the hundreds, but I only have 30 titles. So I'm going to ask a parent to help me scan these. And the parent knew nothing about the laws and started asking questions. And that parent told another parent, and another parent told another parent. And all of a sudden, there's this network of outrage and resistance that legislators do not want to hear from. So those are things that I've learned, you know, and I don't begrudge any teacher that doesn't do it because, you know, the empathy part, right? I get it. I get it. But the fact that ignoring a recommendation is, in fact, an educational strategy was something that stuck with me from that weekend, Jessica.
And Mike, can I go off something you also said? I also think it's the way you can read the standard, because you and David had a discussion. David Blight had a discussion about the skills of the positive skills that enslaved people get, and and his answer was, yeah, they have. Of course, I can teach that because they did have things that helped them and really twisted the standard. And, you know, and I really think that some of these things coming out from the legislative point or from, and for lack of, from Wingnut Radio, whatever, that are people now that are on my school board. I had just a side note, one of the school board members who is in the Wingnut area came up to me and said, you know, my kid loved your Civil War class. I'm so glad you didn't teach that CRT crap. Oh, okay. But we did teach race. Oh, you did? Yeah. The whole time. Kid didn't go home and to talk about it. So, but he didn't even know what I was teaching. He just thought, I guess he thought I was teaching Civil War battles the whole time. So what I'm saying is, I think we can march up to it also, but I think we can't be afraid to teach. I mean, Florida's going to have a problem. I think you and I talked about it, Mike. They're going to lose, they're already losing teachers. So we got to also, there's kind of a moment where you do the right thing. So I don't know. I mean, and that's easy for me to say. I haven't lost my job yet.
Lois, I think that's you bring up a really good point. This idea of like, when I read this question from Katie, I think about the teachers and I think about the students, because it would be very easy for us to say there are these anti-intellectual, divisive concept laws, go in other directions. But there are millions of children in this country that live in these states with this legislation, and they deserve an excellent education just like every other child in this country. And so it's this hard battle. So if we're teaching for children, right, and when I say children, I mean up to 18, right, that they deserve to be presented with the best interpretation of those state standards. To Mike's point, we also have to be teachers that know why we're doing the work that we're doing. We have to understand the standards that are there. but good work has to happen in every state, regardless of the kinds of legislation that is being put forth. And that's a hard thing to say and to expect of someone to give of themselves in that way. And so I think as we think about the work that we do as teachers, do we have those critical partners? Do we have people within our school or our school district that we can talk about the ways in which we're approaching, how we're connecting with our university faculty, with NCHE, about the ways to navigate? Because again, it's not just about state and state legislation. It's about millions of children being educated under the guise of what is or is not history that should be taught.
I think Lois pointed to something important. It's the label that's attached to this that is really what these politicians are obsessed with, because they don't understand the actual substance of it. So in some ways, if you don't lead by saying this is hard history or this is teaching for justice or whatever, but do those things, but teach for justice, teach to understand race and gender, then I think that we can do a lot more than we think. In some ways, by proclaiming that what we're doing is fighting for social justice, makes us a target. If we will just fight for social justice through history, I think that we have kinds of freedom that we can exploit.
So I want to be respectful of time. This conversation has just flown by and lots of great comments in the chat. I want to give all the panelists just a minute to kind of wrap up thoughts and share any final resources. But before that, I want to make sure I make my plug for the service that I push in every space that I'm in, that any educator should think about, is running for school board. Is that we need educators and academics and scholars and people who can process information in a reasonable way to serve on school boards. So that's something that I will stand by and I think would be really beneficial for a lot of our communities. But let's just do a real quick 1 minute around last thoughts. Mike, I'll start with you.
I want to echo what Jessica just said. I think one of the things that we can do a better job of as being historians is giving context to these struggles against public education in the United States, right? Read Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains. Think about what Steve Bannon meant when he said that school boards are the key with which we will pick the lock. Right? There has always been a struggle against public education in this country from the moment that it began. And education is a form of resistance, of active resistance. Keep telling me what I can do. And I say that with all humility. I want to know how I can be the strongest advocate that I can be for you. And keep in mind something Ella Baker said, strong people don't need strong leaders. You guys are the leaders that y'all are looking for.
Thanks.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Ed?
This is kind of what I'd referred to at the beginning. The trickle-down model is not necessary anymore, as this very conversation shows. I mean, our starry-eyed fascination with anything technological has passed. But the fact is that we can now have conversations that cross these other kinds of obstacles in ways that we could not before. And we can also reimagine what history can be. We don't just have to use digital stuff to ship around PDF files. We can actually reimagine what it might look like. And that's the kind of collaboration. Teachers tell us what they need. And there are those of us in museums and in universities who would love to try to help imagine that. So I'd like to end on an optimistic note, is that really we have capacities before us that people didn't have not so long ago, and it's incumbent on us to take advantage of them.
Thanks, Ed. Christy?
I will just echo what both of my colleagues said and thank Jessica, you, for time and leadership in NCHE. I think you have truly created spaces where we're in conversation with one another as opposed to maybe presentation of what we know, I think we become a better profession, PK to 16 to 20 to beyond, because we can truly be together and not just presenting for or sharing information without that idea that there's a dialogue. So that this dialogue has been, I think to Mike's point earlier, truly humbling. And I will invite again the invitation that we are partners in this work, and we only know we're partners in this work if the email comes or the phone call comes or whatever the case might be. And I'm really privileged to be part of this organization and look forward to the next time we have this conversation, because this can't be it. There's too much else going on in the chat. And if I could just say one last little point, where there was some conversation in various places about elementary social studies and elementary history in particular, which is the starting point. We sometimes have this misconception that all of a sudden, because you turn 13, you should now be a little historian. But those things happen right at the beginning. So how do we think as teachers and teachers of young learners about empowering them, those students and their teachers, to be curious about the world and not afraid, as was kind of mentioned in the chat about the content, the pushback and every other thing, but really to be wanderers alongside their students.
Christy, I'm just going to go off of what you said. One of the people in the chat, one of the things that I find great solace with, Kate is in the chat. I was excited to see her because her work is with elementary. And I did leave my email with some people with the stuff I did in elementary. But I think the most important thing is something we mentioned earlier. I cannot emphasize enough how important it's been of the teachers that I've met around the country. There's a cadre of people that I go to all the time. We have a running chat. Joe Welsh, Justin Emmerich, Georgette Hackman. When we were the four of us sat through the pandemic, and we learned quickly that to present online, talking about digital stuff and how it changed things, Ed, I realized that 1 hour online was about 4 hours of prep. And it really did change my teaching to the better, even when I came back live. So I was those four people, and they were not in my district. So it's so important, Jessica, that we have the NCHE, because I might not have it in my building. I might have it, but I have it in little spots in my state. I have a wonderful couple of people. I was on the social studies panel. So I met, or the state social studies, our new adoption, met those people, but I cannot say enough how important it is. I know a whole bunch of people in the chat. We got to stay together. And these conferences, especially NCHE conferences, are critical, that we meet each other and we come together and we talk about these problems, because with that, we get courage within ourselves to face what we are facing in our individual communities.
Well, thank you all so much for this wisdom and the strength and your time. And I've seen some comments about hoping that we can do this again. And I think, as Christy said, the conversation is not finished. And so I just want to leave you with a brief anecdote. The first time I learned from Ed, you're not going to remember this, Ed. This was 2012 at a Gilder Lehrman seminar. You were talking to us at the very beginning, and you were talking about how your mom was saying, why would you want to study history? We already know what happened. And that has stuck with me for over a decade as I think about what happened and how do we know what happened. So thank you all for inspiring me and being part of this community as we try to figure out what happened. So thank you all so much. I'm gonna stop the recording here.